Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 211 and it's titled Turn the Page. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen cards. Now, you may notice my voice does sound a little bit different. It's struggling through a couple of different illnesses at the moment, so I do apologize for that. But, of course, the show must go on, so if you need to increase your volume to be able to hear me, I do apologize. But without any further ado, though, let's talk about our random card of the week, which was suggested to us by Elliot Banbury over on YouTube, and that card is Mazemind Tome. And Mazemind Tome, 2 mana for an artifact. You can tap it to put a page counter on this artifact and scry 1, or you can pay 2 and tap it to put a page counter on this artifact to draw a card, and when there are 4 or more page counters on this artifact, exile it. If you do, you gain 4 life. So this is one of those artifacts that kind of can go anywhere, can kind of do anything. We have the benefit of it being colorless, so obviously we can put it into any deck that we want. It has page counters, which are a kind of manipulation sort of counter that we can use. We can take them away, put them on, find ways to deal with that. But when I was looking at cards to go with this card, I actually came across a bit of a discovery, and that is with our commander this week, because there is only one, well, I was going to say legendary creature, but it's actually not a legendary creature. It's a planeswalker, but it is legal to be our commander, so only one legal commander that cares about page counters. And that is Tasha the Witch Queen. She's 3 blue, black for a 4 loyalty legendary planeswalker Tasha. Whenever you cast a spell you don't own, create a 3/3 black demon creature token. Then you can +1, draw a card, and for each opponent, exile up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from that player's graveyard with a page counter on it. Of course, the most important counter in Magic right now. And you can -3. You may cast a spell from among cards in exile with page counters on them without paying its mana cost. Then, of course, Tasha the Witch Queen can be your commander, which, of course, she is. So this is the only commander we could use that had page counters, so I knew right away she had to be our commander for this deck, and I couldn't quite figure out what I wanted to do. Obviously, the first couple of thoughts that went through my head were something to do with page counters, something to do with, what else can Tasha do? What else can the Mazemind Tome do? And so let's break down some of our themes for this deck and talk really about what our goal is here. So first up, we are leaning into the page counter theme. There's not a ton of things that care about page counters, but we do have something like Tome of Legends, which is 2 mana for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, it enters with a page counter on it, and whenever your commander enters the battlefield or attacks, put a page counter on Tome of Legends. Then you can pay 1 and tap it to remove a page counter to draw a card. So this kind of plays into what Tasha's doing as well, being able to draw additional cards. And it also has page counters, which of course we've already mentioned that we care about. But as I noticed as we were building this, every single card that had page counters, for probably pretty obvious reasons, was either a book or cared about books. And so I thought, what if we could build an entire deck not just around page counters, but around books? And so I went through all of Magic and I tried to find every single card that referenced a book either in the name of the card, the flavor text of the card, or the art of a card. And so as an example, we have Pore Over the Pages, which is 3 blue for a sorcery, draw 3 cards, untap up to 2 lands, then discard a card. Now, I did have to go a little bit deep into the book synergies. Obviously, Pore Over the Pages is an easy one because there's a book featured right there in the art. But that also means that we are looking at cards that have words in the text that are not just book. So we've got things like journal. We have things that are a little bit book-centric, but not technically books, like diaries. But as long as it fit the general qualifications of what a book is, then it found its way into the deck. And as I was putting all of those cards in, I noticed something else. One, we couldn't fill an entire deck just with books. That would be either next to impossible or an absolutely terrible deck. So we tried to split the difference, put in all the cards that I could find for books, not the ones that have like little books hidden in the background. They were kind of the forefront or very noticeable in the art. And then a lot of book cards cared about drawing cards, because if you think back to the way that Magic was first designed, your library is intended to be a planeswalker's spells and the things that they know, their knowledge. So being able to read a book is going to give us more knowledge and therefore draw us more cards. And once we started drawing more cards, we ran into our third theme, which is caring about drawing 2 or more cards in a turn. And a good example of that is Detective of the Month, which is 2 and a blue for a creature, human detective. She's a 2/3. She has Ascend, so if we control 10 or more permanents, we get the city's blessing for the rest of the game. As long as we have the city's blessing, detectives we control can't be blocked. And whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. There are a lot of cards that specifically say when you draw your second card, make a token or do some sort of effect. And we really wanted to lean into the token generators as a way to generate blockers, attackers, and deal with the board state. Because believe it or not, there's not a ton of cards that have books in them that are also creatures. They tend to be a lot of instant sorceries and weirdly enough artifacts. So that is where the most of our deck building is coming from. But with cards like Detective of the Month, we can easily make some creatures and block while also still being an aggressive deck, giving us some sort of win condition. But those are our themes for this week. And the next thing we gotta do is, of course, take a look at some key cards. These are cards that synergize really well with what we're doing, and in some cases can be win conditions or even just value engines all on their own. So the very first card I want to highlight is going to be Words of Waste, which is 2 and a black for an enchantment, and you can pay 1, and the next time you would draw a card this turn, each opponent discards a card from their hand instead. While this could be a bit of a mean card, there are definitely ways with this deck that you can just kind of shut down everything your opponents are doing. This really benefits us because our intention is to draw 2 or more cards a turn. We don't necessarily need to have that actual card draw effect. So if we are drawing our card for turn, and then we've, drawn a second card, we've triggered all of our effects, we get no real benefit from drawing a third card. So we may as well make our opponents discard their cards instead. And like I said, while that's not the nicest way to play this deck, it's certainly very effective because we can put ourselves in our position where we are making our opponents pretty much empty-handed the entire game because we can draw that many cards. And if our opponents are empty-handed, we don't really need to be drawing 5 cards a turn when we can just turn 1 or 2 of them into discard effects, still go up in cards, maybe 2 or 3 cards, and then all of our opponents are no longer having any cards in hand. So Words of Waste, definitely not a nice card to play if you're hoping to keep your friend group, but definitely very powerful. Moving on to our second key card. This one is going to be Min, Wily Illusionist. And Min is 1 blue for a 1/3 legendary creature gnome wizard. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 1/1 blue illusion creature token. With this creature gets +1/+0 for each other illusion you control. And whenever an illusion you control dies, you may put a permanent card with mana value less than or equal to that creature's power from your hand onto the battlefield. So not only is Min a reward for drawing 2 or more cards a turn, being able to make us some illusion tokens that, by the way, are probably some of the best tokens we can get because they each get more powerful for each other one that exists. But at the same time, it protects us from things like removal and from board wipes, because if our opponents decide to wipe the board and we have 5 power illusions in play, they're all going to die and we can just put 5 permanents into play that all have mana value 5 or less. And that can immediately shift things in our favor, so our opponents pretty much have to deal with min before dealing with our board, putting us in a situation where if we can just protect her, there's a very good chance we can wind up winning the game. Moving on though to our final key card, this one is Ledger Shredder. And Ledger Shredder is a card that I honestly forgot about when I was first building this deck until I think someone in my Discord, I don't know who it was. If you're in the Discord and it was you, then shout yourself out in the comments. But completely forgot that ledgers were a thing. So obviously Ledger Shredder is technically like the shredding up of a book of some sort. So gotta make the cut in our book deck. And it is probably the most powerful card in the entire deck because it is 1 in a blue for a 1/3 Bird Advisor. It has flying, and whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, Ledger Shredder connives. And that means that we draw a card, discard a card, and if we discard a non-land, we put a +1/+1 counter on Ledger Shredder. So being able to effectively trigger a card draw effect on every single player's turn, assuming that they're drawing 2 spells, and in some cases even more, because if someone gets into a counterspell war and 2 players cast 2 different spells, then we actually connive twice. But being able to trigger our draw 2 cards effects on our opponent's turns for very minimal interaction and very minimal payment on our side is incredibly effective and one of the easiest ways for us to flesh out our hand, get the cards that we need, and while we're not technically going up in cards because we do draw and discard, we're at least figuring out the cards that we want to keep, getting a massive threat in the Ledger Shredder or maybe even a blocker depending on what we want to be doing, and putting ourselves in a position where our opponents are going to really struggle to deal with what we're doing because we've crafted the perfect hand to try to help us win that game. So those are all of our key cards this week, and the next thing we got to do is take a look at some cool interactions in the deck. And these are cards that synergize really well with each other, but are also in some cases just cards I want to highlight because I think they're fun and a little underrated. So the very first pair of cards I want to talk about is going to be between Notion Thief and Homunculus Horde. Notion Thief, once again, one of the most effective card draw effects in the entire deck, simply because it's 2 blue-black for a 3/1 human rogue. It's got flash, and if an opponent would draw a card except the first one they draw on each of their draw steps, instead they skip that draw and we draw a card. So this essentially allows us to take advantage of our opponent's card draw engines, constantly turning on our draw 2 abilities, constantly triggering all of our effects. And if we combine that with something that wants us to be drawing 2, there's a very good chance we could trigger it every single turn, even on our opponent's turns. And in this case, the card I want to highlight that I would like to trigger on every single one of our opponent's turns is Homunculus Horde. And Homunculus Horde, 3 and a blue for a 2/2 Homunculus. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a token that's a copy of this creature. Notably, that will trigger for every single copy of the Horde. So on our first turn we have it, we draw 2 cards, we now make 1 copy of it, we have 2. The next turn we draw 2 cards, both will trigger, we now have 4. Next turn is 8, then 16, then 32. And you can kind of see how this turns into an unstoppable army of creatures incredibly quickly, especially with something like Notion Thief letting us draw on our opponent's turns and shutting off our opponent's ways to draw into more answers, meaning it's going to be even harder for them to remove our Horde once it gets going. So I think that this is not necessarily a fun interaction. It is definitely a cool one, but again, Notion Thief, very similar to Words of Waste from earlier, shutting off what your opponents are doing can be a little bit mean at certain tables, so take that into account if you do put this deck together. Moving on, though, to our next cool interaction. This one is going to be between Court of Cunning and Wizard's Spellbook. So Court of Cunning is 1 blue for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you become the monarch, and at the beginning of your upkeep, any number of target players each mill 2 cards. If you're the monarch, each of those players mill 10 cards instead. And why exactly do we want to be milling our opponents? Well, option number 1, obviously, we've already mentioned Tasha in our command zone, But additionally, we also have Wizard's Spellbook, which is 5 blue for an artifact. You can tap it to exile target instant or sorcery from a graveyard, then roll a d20, but you can only activate this as a sorcery. If on the d20 you roll a 1 through 9, you copy the exiled card, you may cast the copy. 10 through 19, you copy that card and you may cast the copy by paying 1. And if you get a 20, you can copy each card exiled with Wizard's Spellbook and you may cast any number of the copies without paying their mana costs. So by being able to mill our opponents with Court of Cunning, we can put ourselves in a position where we can use our opponent's instants and sorceries to help us win the game with Wizard's Spellbook. Because even a 1 through 9 casting a copy of the card is very powerful, but even a 10 plus, which is more than half of the time statistically, means we are casting the copy for 1 mana or possibly even less if we hit the 20. Now, this depends fully on what our opponents are doing, but it is worth mentioning that it does also include our graveyards. We can in fact hit our own things, so if there is something like, say, a board wipe or a card draw effect that we want to be able to use again, we can use the spellbook to do that. But otherwise, it's mostly going to be used as a way to steal our opponent's win conditions and just kind of put ourselves in a position where we can outvalue the rest of the table and hopefully someday maybe hit that 20 and win the game on the spot. But that brings us mostly to the end of our interactions and our cards and everything I want to talk about. So the next piece of this deck tech is to talk about the price of the deck. And this week, our total deck price came in at $94.90, so pretty close to our budget limit, with our most expensive card being Fairy Mastermind at a massive $15.26. Now, I originally debated on whether or not I wanted to include this card, but I thought it was good enough and did everything we wanted to do in a way that there really were no replacements for, and so I figured we had the budget, we may as well squeeze it in. But let's talk a little bit about the card and I'll explain why I think it fits. So Fairy Mastermind is 1 and a blue for a 2/1 Fairy Rogue. It's got Flash, Flying, and whenever an opponent draws their second card each turn, you draw a card, then you can pay 3 and a blue and each player draws a card. This is a great way to guarantee that we can trigger our own card draw effects because we can just pay 4 to draw a card at any time, and if an opponent is also drawing their second card at that point, we will then immediately also draw a second card, triggering our card draw effects again. So for 4 mana, Fairy Mastermind lets us effectively trigger those effects whenever we want on any player's turn. Now, with that being said, it is a $15 card, which I did mention earlier, so if you do need to trim it for budget purposes, then cutting it out would get it to below $80, which is a much more manageable price, obviously, than $94. But if you do have the space for it, then I would highly recommend including it in the deck because I do think it's very powerful at what it does. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit outside of our budget range, plus a suggestion for a replacement, then I've got you covered there as well. So this week, if you're putting in and out a budget card, I would recommend throwing in Rhystic Study. And I know, I try to avoid a lot of staple cards and cards that really are just way too expensive and way too stapley. They go in every single deck because it doesn't make sense. Yes, obviously, we're playing blue, include Rhystic Study. However, I do genuinely believe that it fits our theme in this deck for multiple reasons. One, it's got a book in it. Obviously, we got to have books. What other way can we be a book deck without books? And it also draws cards, which is the other thing we want to be doing because, 2 and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1. This is without a doubt one of the most efficient card draw effects in the entire game of Magic when we're talking about Commander. Putting that 1-mana tax on everybody is just absolutely backbreaking early in the game. And like I said, it's got a book in it. So if someone says, hey, I don't like Rhystic Study, why are you playing this in your deck? You can just be like, it's got a book, so it's on theme, so it's not breaking any rules, right? But it is definitely a very salty card, so be aware of that if you do put it in. It is also a massive $52.06. So it is so far above our budget limit. I normally don't include cards that are this expensive, but as much as I hate to admit it, because I personally do not like Rhystic Study as a card, it does do everything we want it to do, and it fits the theme so perfectly that I would recommend including it. On the other hand, if you are putting a card into the deck, you do also have to take a card out of the deck. So the card I would recommend taking out this week is Fairy Vandal, which is 1 and a blue for a 1/2 Fairy Rogue, has flash, flying, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Now, I would argue that this is one of the weaker card draw effects that we have, or I suppose effect isn't the right word, a payoff is probably a better term, because all it's doing is putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control, which isn't super powerful. It's not something that's going to run away with the game. It's not something that's going to help us toward more victories. So I think that if you're looking to cut a card that rewards us for drawing cards, then Fairy Vandal's probably one of the weaker ones. We really want to keep the ones that can generate tokens or some other sort of value. And Fairy Vandal can just kind of sit around, maybe block, and probably be blocked if we're being honest. So not quite what we're looking for, especially when compared to a powerhouse like Rhystic Study. But that is our deck for this week. And before we get into a game to showcase how it performs, I do want to take a second to highlight some ways you can help support the channel, and of course shout out our current patrons and channel members as well. So as always, you can just like this video, subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. My goal is for us to hit 2,000 subscribers in the next couple of months, which is an absolute insane number to me. I genuinely never thought that we would get that many. So if you could help us get there, I would really appreciate it. But if you want to go a little bit above and beyond, you can also find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member, which is linked in the description. And there you'll get access to things like the deck lists a week early, a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games that appear on the channel. Plus you get access to the unedited gameplay videos where you can see everybody else kind of joking around, having a good time, and also trying to deal with some crazy math equations at some points. Plus a random card shipped to you every single month. So with that being said, of course, we got to give a shout out to our current patrons and channel members. So a thank you goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Ryder Cole, Jeffrey Boos, Vintage, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Jakar, Galen, Brian Holiday, Richard, The Oak Monster, and Tuku Spooner. So to all of you, thank you all so much. And if you would like to have your name listed among all of these amazing people, check us out on Patreon or right here on YouTube as a channel member. And one last thing before I stop the little rant about why you should join us. If you're also interested in some sweet, one-of-a-kind, amazingly illustrated and beautiful tokens, drawn by yours truly, of course, then you can also join us at the $7 tier as a patron or channel member, where alongside the card that I will send you every month, I will also include a tiny little token just as a thank you from me. But with all of that out of the way, let's start talking about how this deck performs in a game and test it out against 3 very powerful opponents this week. So first up, we have Jason and his Morska deck. This is, I believe, 100% the precon, so it's fully dedicated to clues and everything along the lines of drawing cards and artifact synergies. Next up, our second opponent, we have Doodle with Sauron, Lord of the Rings, running a Grixis Reanimator deck, so he wants to just put giant creatures in the graveyard as early as possible, and then get them back out so he can do some kind of wild shenanigans. And last but not least, we have Cole playing Edgar Markov. This is, of course, a vampire deck. He was recently gifted a copy of Edgar, I believe he said from his wife. He can correct me if I'm wrong. And this is one of those cards that is just an absolute powerhouse on the battlefield, and in Edgar's case, actually off of the battlefield, thanks to the Eminence mechanic. So I think that if I had to pick one of these cards to be the most concerned about, I think it's definitely Edgar Markov. I have seen how quickly he can flood the board and just really get out of hand, and I know that there's a ton of vampire synergies that can push him even more over the top. Now, that's not to say that I am underestimating the other two opponents, because I also think they are massive threats as well. I'm just saying I think Edgar's a little bit more on the concerning side to me. But of course, I would love to hear your ideas as well, so please let me know down in the comments who you think is going to walk out the winner. Make sure you get your predictions in, and as always, I hope you enjoy the video. I'm sure I certainly will. It's going to be a good game, I have no doubt, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Jason goes first, followed by myself, Doodle, and then Cole. On Jason's first turn, he plays an island. I play an island and cast Codex Shredder, which can tap to mill a player for 1 and lets me pay 5 and sacrifice it to return a card from my graveyard to my hand. Doodle plays a Sulphur Falls. Cole plays a Jagged Baron. Jason plays a Forest, and at the end of turn, I mill Cole for 1 with the Codex Shredder. On my turn, I play a Scavenger Grounds and cast Arcane Signet. Doodle plays a Command Tower and casts Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size. Cole plays a Swamp and casts Restless Bloodseeker, letting him make a blood token in his end step if he gained life that turn, and it can also be transformed by sacrificing 2 blood tokens. Then, thanks to his commander, Edgar Markov, he also makes a 1/1 vampire token since he cast a vampire. Jason plays a Plains and casts his commander, Morska Undersea Sleuth, gaining no maximum hand size, investigating at the beginning of his upkeep, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on Morska whenever he draws his second card each turn. I play a Thought Vessel, gaining no max hand size, and I also realized that I forgot to mill an opponent at the end of turn, so the table agrees to let me say I milled Cole for 1. After that, I cast Tome of Legends, entering with a page counter, getting another whenever my commander enters, and lets me remove a counter to draw a card. Doodle plays a Mountain and casts a Worn Power Stone, then cast Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards and discarding 2 cards. Cole plays an Exotic Orchard, then attacks Doodle and I both for 1. In his second main phase, he casts Falcon Wrath Torturer, letting him sacrifice a creature to give itself flying until the end of turn, and making another vampire token. In Jason's upkeep, he makes a Clue token, then plays a Forest and casts Innocuous Researcher, making each player parlay when it attacks, making a clue for each non-land revealed this way, and also letting Jason untap his lands in his end step, but if he does, then he can't cast spells until his next turn. He moves to combat, attacking Doodle for 2 with Morska, then at the end of turn, Jason untaps all of his lands, and I mill him for 1 with the Codex Shredder. On my turn, I cast Detective of the Month, creating a 2/2 detective token whenever I draw my second card each turn, and if I have the City's Blessing, making my detectives unblockable. Then I activate Tome of Legends, removing a counter from it to draw a card, making a detective. Finally, I play an island and cast the Underworld Cookbook, giving me 10 permanents, so I now have the City's Blessing. On Doodle's turn, he casts Persist, returning Infernal Sovereign from his graveyard to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter. This now forces him to skip his draw step, but whenever he plays a land or casts a spell, he draws a card and loses a life. After that, Doodle plays a Swamp, drawing a card and losing a life, and then also casts Cavern Horde Dragon, which makes treasure tokens equal to the number of artifacts a player controls whenever it deals combat damage to that player. This also draws him a card and makes him lose a life. Then, since the dragon has haste, Doodle is able to attack me with it for 6, making 5 treasure tokens since I control 5 artifacts. Notably, Doodle also attacks Cole for 5 with the Infernal Sovereign, thanks to the anger in his graveyard giving all his creatures haste. In his second main phase, Doodle uses his treasures to cast Sauron the Dark Lord, now amassing Orcs 1 whenever an opponent casts a spell, being tempted by the ring whenever an army he controls deals combat damage to a player, and discarding his hand to draw 4 whenever he's tempted by the ring. Thanks to the Sovereign, this draws him a card, and he loses a life. Cole plays a mountain and attacks Doodle for 2 with his 2 vampire tokens, but Doodle blocks 1 with Sauron, killing it and only taking 1. Then in his second main phase, Cole casts Drana, Liberator of Malakir, putting a +1/+1 counter on each of his attacking creatures whenever she deals combat damage. This makes him another vampire token and lets Doodle amass Orcs 1. At the end of turn, Jason sacrifices a clue to draw a card. In Jason's upkeep, he makes another clue, then attacks Cole for 2 with Morska, and attacks me for 3 with the Researcher, making each player parlay, revealing the top card of their library, revealing 2 non-lands, so Jason makes 2 clues, then each player draws a card, triggering Morska, putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it, so Cole takes 4. Then in his second main phase, Jason casts Kappa Cannoneer, putting a +1/+1 counter on it and making it unblockable until the end of turn whenever an artifact enters under his control, letting Doodle amass Orcs 1. Finally, he plays an Azorius Chancery, returning a forest to his hand, and as an end step, untaps all his lands, and at the end of turn, I activate Codex Shredder to mill Jason for 1. On my turn, I play a Swamp, then cast my commander, Tasha the Witch Queen, letting me make a 3/3 demon token whenever I cast a spell I don't own, putting another page counter on Tome of Legends, and letting Doodle amass Orcs 1. Then I activate Tasha's +1 ability, drawing a card and exiling up to 1 instant or sorcery from each opponent's graveyard with a page counter on it, only exiling Doodle's Persist, and also making another detective token. After all of that is resolved, I attack Doodle for 4 with my 2 unblockable creatures, and in my second main phase, I cast Vessel of Malignity, letting Doodle amass Orcs 1. On Doodle's turn, he plays a Swamp, drawing a card and losing a life, then casts Scourge of the Throne, which has Dethrone, and whenever it attacks for the first time each turn, if it's attacking the player with the highest life total, Doodle gets to untap all his creatures and get an additional combat phase. This also draws him a card and makes him lose a life. Then he attacks me for 6 with the Cavern Horde Dragon, making 5 treasure tokens, attacks Cole for 16 with Sauron, the Army, and the Sovereign, and attacks Jason for 5 with the Scourge, triggering the Scourge, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, untapping all his creatures and getting an additional combat phase. This means I take 6, Jason takes 6, and Cole blocks with Drana, a vampire token, and the Bloodseeker, killing them all but taking no damage, notably also sacrificing a token with the Torturer to give itself flying until the end of turn. Before Doodle's next attack step, Jason sacrifices 2 clues, drawing 2 cards and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on Morska. Then, for Doodle's second attack, he attacks Cole for 11 with Sauron and the Army, attacks Jason with the Scourge for 6, putting another +1/+1 counter on it so he takes 7, and attacks me for 6 with the Dragon, again getting 5 treasures. Since the Orc army dealt combat damage to Cole, Doodle is tempted by the ring, making Sauron his ring bearer, and he gets to discard his hand and draw 4. In his second main phase, Doodle cast Frantic Search, drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards and untapping 3 lands, also drawing another card and losing a life. After that, he cast Tahada's Ploy, drawing 3 cards, discarding a card, losing a life, and gaining life equal to the number of cards he's discarded this turn, which is 7. After that, he uses all but one of his remaining treasures to cast his commander, Sauron Lord of the Rings, drawing a card, losing a life, amassing Orcs 5, milling himself for 5, and returning Hoarding Broodlord from his graveyard to the battlefield. When the Broodlord enters, Doodle gets to search his library for a card, exiling it face down and being able to play it for as long as it remains exiled, also giving his spells he cast from exile Convoke. Once that's resolved, he casts Victimize from exile thanks to it having Convoke, drawing a card, losing a life, and sacrificing his Orc army to return a Tali Primal Storm and Hostage Taker from his graveyard to the battlefield. When the hostage taker enters, it exiles Morska, letting Doodle cast it for mana of any color for as long as it remains exiled. On Cole's turn, he cast Cover of Darkness, naming vampires, so all his vampires have fear. Then he also cast Cordial Vampire, making another vampire token, and putting a +1/+1 counter on each vampire he controls whenever a creature dies. Finally, he plays an Abandoned Outpost and passes. Jason plays a forest and casts Farewell, exiling all creatures and graveyards, notably returning his Morska to play. At the end of turn, I use Codex Shredder to mill Cole for 1. On my turn, I play a Temple of Deceit, scrying 1, then I cast Homunculus Horde, creating a token copy of it whenever I draw my second card each turn. This lets me activate Tasha's +1 ability, drawing a card, creating a copy of the Homunculus, and exiling both Farewell and Clever Concealment with page counters on them. Finally, I sacrifice Vessel of Malignity to make Jason exile 2 cards from his hand. Doodle plays a Drowned Catacombs and casts Nezahal Primal Tide, letting him draw a card whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, giving him no max hand size, and it can be exiled until the next end step by discarding 3 cards. After that, he casts Careful Study, drawing 2 cards and discarding 2. Cole plays a mountain and casts his commander, Edgar Markov, immediately using him to attack Doodle since he has haste and fear, putting a +1/+1 counter on each vampire he controls and hitting Doodle for 5. In Jason's upkeep, he makes another clue, then casts his own Detective of the Month, letting him sacrifice a clue, draw a card, make a detective token, and put 2 +1/+1 counters on Morska. Finally, he attacks Cole for 4 with Morska, and at the end of turn, I mill Jason for 1. On my turn, I play an island and activate Tasha's +1 ability, exiling Careful Study from Doodle's graveyard, drawing a card and making 2 more copies of the Homunculus Horde. After that resolves, I cast Gyruda, Doom of Depths, milling each player for 4 and letting me return a creature with an even mana value from among the milled cards to the battlefield under my control. This lets me put Jason's Joel Rael, Moonvoli Recluse into play, now letting me make a 2/2 cat token whenever I draw my second card each turn. Finally, I cast Investigator's Journal, entering with 6 suspect counters since I control 6 creatures, and letting me pay 2, tap it and remove a counter to draw a card, or pay 2 and sacrifice it to draw a card. This also triggers Nezahal, letting Doodle draw a card. On Doodle's turn, he plays an island and attacks Jason for 7 with Nezahal, but before damage, Jason casts Swords to Plowshares to try to exile Nezahal. Before this can resolve, this draws Doodle a card, and then he's able to discard 3 to exile Nezahal and return it to play tapped at the end of turn. This does let Doodle in his second main phase cast Blasphemous Act to do 13 damage to each creature, completely wiping the board. Once that resolves, Doodle casts Stitch Together, returning Treasure Nabber from his graveyard to the battlefield, now letting him gain control of any artifact until the end of his next turn, whenever an opponent taps that artifact for mana. Finally, at the end of turn, Nezahal returns to play tapped. On Cole's turn, he cycles a Shattered Landscape, plays a Temple of Malice, scrying 1, and casts Herald's Horn, now looking at the top card of his library in his upkeep, being able to reveal it and put it into his hand if it's a vampire. This also draws Doodle a card with Nezahal. Jason cast Aerial Extortionist, intending to exile Nezahal, but Doodle has a response, countering the Extortionist with Arcane Denial, letting Doodle draw a card in the next upkeep while Jason draws 2. That means that in my upkeep, Doodle draws a card and Jason draws 2, then I play an island and activate Tasha's -3 ability to cast Jason's Farewell for free from exile, making a demon token, but that doesn't matter, as it, all other creatures, and all graveyards get exiled. Doodle does, though, in response, discard 3 cards to exile Nezahal and return it to play at the end of turn. After the board wipe has resolved, I cast Alondra Skydreamer, letting me make a 2/2 Drake token whenever I cast my second card each turn, and whenever I draw my fifth card each turn, giving Alondra and all Drakes I control +X, where X is the number of cards in my hand. Then I activate Investigator's Journal, drawing a card and making a Drake. Doodle recasts his commander Sauron, amassing Orcs 5, milling 5, and returning Jin-Gitaxias Progress Tyrant from his graveyard to the battlefield, now, once a turn, copying the first artifact, instant, or sorcery he casts, while countering the first artifact, instant, or sorcery his opponents cast each turn. After that resolves, Doodle attacks Jason for 7 with Nezahal. On Cole's turn, he casts Bartolome del Presidio, making a vampire token as well thanks to Edgar. Jason plays an island and casts Finale of Revelation for X = 0, but it doesn't matter as it's countered by Jin-Gitaxias. It does, however, draw Doodle a card. This means that Jason's next spell is guaranteed to resolve, so he casts Fumigate, destroying all creatures and gaining a life for each creature destroyed this way, also drawing Doodle a card. In response, Doodle discards 3 to exile Nezahal until the end of turn, then the board wipe resolves and Jason gains 7 life. On my turn, I play a Myriad Landscape and activate Tasha's -3 ability to cast Doodle's Careful Study, making a 3/3 demon token, drawing 2 and discarding 2. After that, I cast Mazemind Tome, which can be tapped to put a page counter on it and scry 1, or tapped, letting me pay 2 mana to put a page counter on it and draw a card, exiling the artifact and gaining 4 life when it gets 4 page counters. This triggers Nezahal, but before Doodle can draw, I flash in Notion Thief, now letting me draw a card instead of my opponents whenever they would draw a card other than the first one they draw in their draw steps. This means that when the Nezahal trigger resolves, I'm the one who draws the card. Doodle casts a Commander Sphere, then attacks Jason for 7 with Nezahal. Cole casts a Knight's Whisper to draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, also triggering Nezahal. Unfortunately for my opponents, thanks to Notion Thief, this means I draw 3 cards while Cole still loses 2. After that, Cole casts Macabre Waltz, drawing me a card, returning Carrier Thrall and Stromkirk Noble from his graveyard to his hand, then discarding a card. After that, he casts both the Stromkirk Noble and the Carrier Thrall he just got back, making 2 vampire tokens. Jason recasts his commander Morska, then also cast Erdwall Illuminator, investigating an additional time whenever he investigates for the first time each turn. He then plays a Simic Growth Chamber, returning a Plains to his hand, and at the end of turn, I activate Mazemind Tome, putting a page counter on it to draw a card, and also Investigator's Journal, removing a counter from it to draw another card. On my turn, I play a Swamp, cast a Soul Ring, drawing a card thanks to Nezahal, then I also cast Words of Waste, drawing another card and now letting me pay 1 so that the next time I would draw a card this turn, instead each of my opponents discard a card. This lets me activate Tasha's +1 ability, exiling Farewell, Chaos Warp, and Knight's Whisper with page counters, also paying 1 mana instead of drawing my card to force each opponent to discard a card. Finally, I attack Doodle for 3 with Notion Thief, and pass. Doodle plays a Dragon Skull Summit, recasts his commander Sauron, but in response, I sacrifice my Scavenger Grounds to exile each player's graveyard. This still lets Sauron's abilities resolve though, so Doodle amasses Orcs 5, mills 5, and returns Burning Rune Demon from his graveyard to the battlefield. This then lets him search his library for 2 cards with different names, revealing them, letting an opponent choose one to put into his hand and the other to put into his graveyard. Once that's resolved, he winds up with Sheoldred in his hand thanks to Jason, and Sheoldred Whispering One in his graveyard. After that's resolved, he attacks Tasha for 7 with Nezahal, killing my commander. Cole cast a Revel in Riches, gaining a treasure whenever an opponent Target's creature dies, and winning the game in his upkeep if he controls 10 or more treasures. This also triggers Nezahal, so I pay 1 to make each of my opponents discard a card. In Jason's upkeep, he investigates twice, plays a Plains, and attacks Cole for 1 with the Illuminator. Then, in his second main phase, Jason casts Organic Extinction, destroying all non-artifact creatures. This draws me a card with Nezahal, so instead I pay 1 to make each of my opponents discard a card. Notably, since 8 creatures die in the board wipe, Cole makes 8 treasure tokens. Then at the end of turn, I sacrifice my Myriad Landscape to search my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. On my turn, I recast my commander Tasha, putting a page counter on Tome of Legends, and immediately activate her +1 ability to draw a card, exile Organic Extinction and Rise of the Dark Realms with page counters on them. After that, I cast Insidious Bookworms and play a Guildless Commons, returning a swamp to my hand. Doodle plays a Foreboding Ruin and passes. Cole recasts his commander, Edgar Markov, using him to attack Tasha for 5, putting a counter on his commander when he attacks. I choose to block with the Bookworms, giving Cole another treasure, and paying 2 mana when the worms die to force Jason to discard a card at random. At the end of turn, Jason sacrifices a clue to draw a card. On Jason's turn, he plays an Archway of Invention, then recasts his commander Morska. At the end of turn, I mill Doodle for 1 with the Codex Shredder, and still at the end of turn, I cycle Desert of the Glorified, then activate Tome of Legends to draw a card, but instead of drawing, I pay to make each opponent discard a card. On my turn, I play a Swamp and then mill Doodle for 1 with Codex Shredder, and cast Gixian Puppeteer, making each opponent lose 2 life while I gain 2 life whenever I draw my second card each turn. Then I remove the last counter from Tome of Legends, paying to make each opponent discard a card, and also remove a counter from Investigator's Journal, again paying to make each opponent discard a card. Now that all my opponents have empty hands, I can safely activate Tasha's -3 ability, creating a 3/3 demon token, and casting Doodle's Rise of the Dark Realms, returning all creatures from all graveyards to the battlefield under my control. Once this has resolved, I get Bookworms, Notion Thief, Nezahal, Sheoldred Whispering One, Jin-Gitaxia's Progress Tyrant, Burning Rune Demon, Carrier Thrill, Stromkirk Noble, and Obsessive Stitcher. The only 2 that trigger upon entering is the Demon, letting me search my library for 2 cards, with Cole choosing to put Breach the Multiverse into my graveyard and Maddening Cacophony into my hand, and Sheoldred, making Cole sacrifice his commander. Also at this point, Jason doesn't see himself finding a way to win, so he decides to concede. At the end of turn, I draw 7 cards with Jin-Gitaxias, gaining 2 life and making each opponent lose 2 life. After Doodle is drawn for his turn, but before he can move to his first main phase, I activate Mazemind Tome to draw a card, paying 1 to replace the draw by making each opponent discard a card. This turns out to be the right call, as he drew a Feed the Swarm, which could have killed a creature, given Cole his 10th treasure token, and let him win on the following turn. This trick doesn't work on Cole's turn though, because he reveals Null Priest of Oblivion with Herald's Horn, putting it into his hand before drawing his card for turn. This means he's able to cast the Order of Sacred Dusk, which gives his vampires Exalted, also making a vampire token. Then he recasts his commander Edgar. Since both of the non-token vampires have haste, he attacks me with them both, putting a +1/+1 counter on each of his vampires thanks to Edgar. I block Edgar with Sheoldred Whispering One, killing Cole's commander while the Order deals 6 damage to me and he gains 6 life. Then in Cole's second main phase, he casts Null Priest of Oblivion, making another vampire token. On my turn, I play a command tower and attack Cole with my entire board of creatures, and even though he's able to block 3 of them, he still takes exactly 17 total damage, getting knocked out of the game. At this point, since Doodle knows I can just make him discard the card he draws for turn and lock him out of playing, he also decides to concede at this point, winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a long game. That game was almost 2 hours long, and I did feel a little bit bad by the end of it, just being able to kind of lock our opponents out of the game with Words of Waste and all of our card draw effects. And we joked about it throughout the course of the game, talking about how I was just over there reading books, and it really didn't feel like I was doing much. But once everything really got set up and our deck started to take off, it just felt like a well-built machine. Everything just kind of synergized and everything worked together, and we were drawing cards and had removal, and we could take from our opponents what we needed thanks to Tasha. So being able to take a Farewell, being able to take a card draw effect like Careful Study, being able to take the Rise of the Dark Realms that eventually won us the game was definitely one of those effects that I didn't expect going into it. I didn't think Tasha would be that effective, but it was nice to see that she was. And with everything else going on in the deck, also a ton of card draw, which really helped us get to where we needed to be. Moving around the table, talking about some of our opponents, Doodle being the next player in turn order, very, very effective at what he did. I took a screenshot of the script that I write out for the gameplay, and I sent it to my Discord after Doodle's 5th turn, where he just popped off and reanimated so many things and took multiple combats, did a ton of damage, and I specifically said that I think that might be the best turn 5 I had ever seen playing Commander, so definitely a huge pop-off from his deck. Getting a little bit hurt by the multiple board wipes. I know Jason casting 3 of them and myself casting 1, 2 of which being Farewell to hurt the graveyard deck. Not exactly the best showing, but despite all of that, it was still Doodle's cards that won the game, because I certainly would not have been able to win without that Rise of the Dark Realms, without all of the massive creatures that I got because of it. So of course, thank you goes out to Doodle for the massive assist there in that one. And then continuing to move around, we get to Cole and his Edgar list. This one definitely also did Edgar things. I think he got a little unfortunate that he was stuck on some mana. He couldn't quite cast a ton of spells in a single turn, and I think that set him back because he couldn't find a lot of Lord effects. He couldn't find a lot of ways to avoid getting hit by people and other things like that. So definitely one of those decks that could be given the chance to pop off. I just don't think that this was quite the game for it. And then, of course, last but not least, Jason. Always a threat when he's playing a pre-con deck. Morska is an incredibly powerful commander, but because Jason had to take so many of his turns to keep wiping the board, he really put himself in a situation where he kept trying to save everybody else, and then that kind of just backfired on him as his opponents got to rebuild quicker. So very interested to see what he can do with Morska in the future, because I'm sure we'll see it again. But overall, let me know down in the comments what you thought of the game. Let me know what you think of the deck. If there's any cards you would like to see added to the deck, please do let me know. I love hearing about the cards that I missed. And in this case especially, if there's any book cards I missed, please let me know. I did my best, but I'm sure I missed something. And as always, if you have any suggestions for future videos, please do let me know that as well. I'm happy to build around whatever card suggestions you've got for me. So with all of that being said, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.